Hi and welcome to a new video of the series BPMN in Action, and today we talk about modeling best practices and also to a topic that's close to my heart, that's anti-pattern, because anti-patterns normally make me cry or laugh or both at the same time, and I think it's always good if we talk about the best practices also to look at the anti-pattern, so the completely opposite, because that really gives us a good indication why we should apply best practices. My name is Nele Uhlemann and I'm a developer advocate here at Camunda, and I really like BPMN, and I think there are way too many bad BPMN models out there, so I really hope this video helps you to create better process models. What actually does mean better process models? So normally if we model a process, we don't do that just for ourselves, but we use it as a tool for communication. And with every language and everything we want to communicate, we want other people to understand. So the main goal of applying best practices is basically to create readable process models. And that is important to keep in mind because BPMN allows you some flexibility. So the standard is not describing those best practices. It's something that you figure out because you make your process better to read and things like that. And that's why it's always good to think of those best practices. And this best practices consist basically three parts. And the first part will describe the modeling rules. So what can we do on the level of the BPMN diagram to make our BPMN diagram better, or that we can read it better. The second one is talking about the scopes, because often we see bad process models because they try to include two scopes at the same time, and we should really think about those scopes again. And the last part is talking about the organization, and that means in terms what can an organization do to support people modeling the best? So how can we define guidelines? How can we maybe educate people about best practices? And let's get started with the first part about the modeling rules. So if we talk about the modeling rules in general, what we can do is a list here that you also can find in the Camunda best practices. I will put the link into the video description, but there are some things we can do. We can, for example, we can use explicit modeling. We can use a certain layout for our model. That means left to right, but also we can, for example, use a raster layout. We should use always labels. We should consider not using lanes, and we should prevent duplicates. And we are going to walk through this now in more detail, and let's have a look into explicit modeling, what that means. In general, you can say that implicit and explicit modeling are both fine in the BPMN standard, and implicit modeling means you use no gateways. So you leave gateways out whenever you can, and explicit modeling means you always model with gateways. And from the best practice perspective, it's always good to use the gateways. And let's have a look into an anti-pattern of implicit modeling and how we can improve it with using gateways. And I'm here in the Camunda web modeler, where you can sign up and start modeling directly. And actually, I'm a big fan of Indian food. Some people know me already, so you know that. And one of my favorite South Indian dishes is actually dosa. And I once tried to find out how you could make it. And I think it's quite complex if you've never made it, but it involves a lot of ingredients to make the dough. And that's basically just the start here. But what I have here is basically the start of a recipe for getting the dosa dough. And what you can see here is you need to get the large pot, and then we add some dal. And then we need another pot, and then we add some cups of rice. And the interesting question I have here now, because we don't use gateways, and that is a complete correct BPMN model. So my question here is, how many times do we add rice, and how many other pots are we getting? So from the logic of what we want is we just want to get one, right? So we just want to get one other pot and we want to add one other cup of rice. I'm just including here a wait state for the token simulation. So we can see what really is happening here by not using gateways. So I turn on the token simulation, and now I can see that I basically create 3 tokens. And those 3 tokens are not synchronized. That means all those 3 tokens get to another pot. That means we have 3 times another pot. Also, we now, do it once with add the cups of rice, rinse the dolls. We do it a second time, and we do it a third time. And from the BPMN spec, the model is correct, but from our semantic, the model probably is not what we want, because we just want to have one. So what is this implicit modeling doing exactly here? So it means if we don't use a gateway for outcoming sequence flows, we always have a parallel behavior. That means we create 3 tokens. But the tricky part is whenever we point to a single element with multiple sequence flows, we don't use a parallel gateway for synchronizing. We have an XOR logic. So what it really does here is basically, I use here the parallel one. And now I should delete this one here. But here I'm using, in the implicit way, the XOR gateway. So that's what's happening, but it's it's not so easy if we don't have the gateways to really understand that this is happening. So that's why the recommendation is always use the gateways, because now if we see that we have this construct here, we do see we have a problem, because here we don't have a synchronizing parallel gateway, but we can change that quite easily to a synchronized one. And now if we do the token simulation, I can have all those tokens. They are combining, and then when they are combining again, they go and continue with the process, and that makes sure that all the other activities are just executed once in our process model. And that's basically the first part when we talk about readable process models, that we should always make sure that we include the gateways. Let's look into the next topic, and that's basically about layout and labels. And we can create better process models if we consider modeling from left to right, because BPMN was built for it. It's something like you would read a book. We can help the readers to understand the model better if we use a raster layout. So that means, for example, that we model, if possible, events and tasks in a raster, or like end events at the same height, so all the end events line up really nicely. We should try not to cross sequence flows, so we should prevent crossing those sequence flows. That can be sometimes a little bit tricky depending on the model, but this is like a good rule. And when it comes to labels, we should label everything that should have a label, because it helps to understand the model better. We should try to find precise labels. That means for events, we always want to use a passive language, because an event always symbolizes something in our process that has passed already. So a good rule here is subject plus verb in the past tense. And for tasks, we try to have an active language. That means we do something actively here in the process. That means we have a good rule if, say, we have the verb and then the subject. And for the gateways, it's very important that we always have, if we split according to some data, that we have the question and the options on the sequence flows. And let's have a look what that means in practice. Okay, I'm again here in the web modeler, and this model is validating a lot of things. So from the layout perspective, we are not modeling from right to left. We have a mix between left to right, but also top to down. We have problems with the labels, we have crossing sequence flows, and we don't have a raster layout. So let's fix first the layout before we start talking about labels and what the process is doing. So I will connect with you shortly. Okay, first things first, this is already left to right, but we are still not compliant with the other modeling layout rules. So we still have crossing sequence flows, which we would like to prevent. So what I can do here is using this, or putting this over this one here, and also putting this one here. So now it should be better. So now at least I have no crossing sequence flows anymore. I'm modeling from left to right. So I have a really better structure of the process. I can better understand the flow of the process because I just have to concentrate to read from left to right and not from top to down. The other thing I can make it now a little bit nicer is from the layout perspective to apply the raster logic. That means I try to align elements under each other. So for example, trying to find here was the event the middle of the task, aligning those two tasks under each other and also this event. And that makes it already a little bit nicer to read as well. Okay, let's focus on the labels and why labels are so important. So first of all, I don't have an indication of why we start this process, so I have no idea what is triggering the process, and I also have just eat as an end result, which is not really something that is a passive thing, but if I eat something that's very active. So what this process really is doing is that someone is hungry and the end event is hunger satisfied. So we should label that. So we should say here hungry, or I'm hungry, hunger or hunger needs to be satisfied or something like that, but hungry could be something here. And then the end event is not eat. It's actually an indicator that probably the process misses a task after ordering and cook. We probably would like to eat food, so it's an activity and a task we need to include with eat food. And then here we have the hunger is satisfied. Also, if I zoom out now I know at least what the start and end event is, but if I go here and see hungry and I see decide, but what decision are we making? And decide maybe on getting food. And then here the question could be, are we cooking or are you cooking? And if yes, we do all this like buy ingredients, prepare ingredients and cook, but also here it would be nicer to say cook food because we want to know what we cook. Here also we choose, but we choose a restaurant. Then we check the waiting line. If the waiting line is too long, we buy ingredients, we cook ourselves. If the waiting line is okay, then we wait here. Again, there is no label for what are we waiting. Actually, probably if we are in a waiting line, we wait for a table. So we could say for a table here, we order food and then of course we wait for the food. So food arrived and then we can eat the food and then the hunger is satisfied. And I could do that quite quickly because I modeled the process initially and I know what I wanted to do here. But if you have no idea what I wanted to do and what I wanted to express, it can get quite tricky and there is a lot of room for interpretation. And we don't want to give that room if we want to create readable process models because they should be clear. Let's talk about the next thing, and this is kind of, I think sometimes difficult for some people to understand why we at Camunda don't like lanes, or a lot of people here don't like lanes, because it is written in the BPMN spec that you can use them, and they can be quite handy if you have really short models. We will talk about that in the scoping or scope of the model. So if we talk about a strategic process model, it can make sense to use a lane. So what are lanes general for in BPMN? So the general idea of lanes is that you can show responsibilities. So you can say who is doing what exactly. So that means if you have a pool separate into single lanes, that every task in that pool belongs to a lane. But also that means that other symbols belong to the pool. So, for example, the sequence flow or events, they don't belong to a certain lane. And also within lanes, we cannot outline that communication between different participants in that process is or might happen. We need to find a different concepts for that. So let's have a look why lanes, if you have a wrong scope, can sometimes be quite tricky for your process model. Back to the Camunda Web Modeler, and what I have here is a restaurant process. I have a customer, I have a waiter, I have a bar, and I have a chef. And you could probably imagine we start the process with a hungry customer, and hopefully we end the process here with a with the hunger satisfied customer. Also means because the end event doesn't really belong to the customer, I could even place it here within the waiter. Now, if we just look into the structure, we don't have to look into details here in the model, but if we look in the structure again, what is missing is the nice view of the happy path, because lanes force us sometimes to model from top to down. And that was something we just talked about in the previous section. That's something that is not helping with creating readable process models. So if you use lanes, you are forced to this top to down modeling, which is not so nice. Let's try to have the same process without lanes. So if I go to the same process here and I say, okay, I don't have any lanes anymore, and we just look again at the structure. So I don't want you to understand the complete process here, but the idea is to see the structure. And then again, I would say the structure here is way nicer because what we see here is really, again, the outline of the process. You might wonder now and want to say, how can we show responsibilities? And that's a really good question. But what we can use, for example, is to show and outline responsibilities is communication flows or collapse pools with communication flows. So let's have a look into that. So what I did is that every participant got a collapse pool. So we have the customer, the waiter, the chef, and we have the barkeeper here in the process. And now they are connected with message flows to the tasks they are performing in the overall process. And you can see it here, for example, with order, take order. And that's one way how you can actually model integration with different roles, but also different systems. And I would need to fix some things here. You can see it's getting quite messy with a lot of message flows, right? So a lot of message flows also are sometimes not really nice because they are crossing in general, or that's a rule I have. If something is crossing a sequence flow and a message flow, they can cross, but I prevent crossing sequence flows, but still this is not nice. Another idea, what you could do here is using maybe colors to identify different responsibilities. So let's have a look and change this to colors. Okay, that's not the same model without the message flows. I would say message flows sometimes really work for showing system integration. This way it was going on a lot in this model. So then sometimes it can be nice to work with colors. And here it's very important to understand that there is no rule for colors defined in the BPMN specification. So no rule when you use what. So normally BPMN should be understandable without colors. And if you use colors, make sure that the people understand why you use them. So because there is no defined rule to it, you need to make sure everyone who reads the model understands the rule around the colors. In this case, I said it like the waiter gets a blue color, the customer gets a yellow color, we have the chef with no color, and we have the barkeeper with red color. And then that's also a way how we can outline responsibilities in a flow without using lanes, and therefore we are not losing the nice overview of our process. Okay, let's talk about the last aspect, and that are duplications. And in general, it's good to prevent duplications because if you have double things in your process, that makes the process model bigger. Also, you need to implement things 2 times, 3 times, depending. And also if we talk about maintenance of the model, so if you want to change at one point of the model something, you need to change it at 2 places or even at 3. So the idea also is if you need to make a change, just make it at 1 point, and that applies then to everything. And let's go back to the web modeler to see what duplication we have. I go back to our process here now with the with no lanes, and we actually do have a duplication here. We have here the clean table thing, and we have here the clean table thing, and both are performed by the waiter. That's an indicator that this task really is double. And we have the clean table here again in the end. So we have it 3 times in the process, and let's see if we can slightly move that. So by redefining the structure, I can prevent duplicates, like in this case. So I merged basically those things, and now we just have the clean table thing once. So after we serve the drinks, we look for empty glasses, and after we serve food, we basically look here for the empty plates. And yeah, so the idea here basically is that we have it just once. We still have it somewhere here, and this is a little bit harder to merge now. So I could do multiple things now if I want to merge it. I could, for example, say if I really have this like at two different parts of the process, maybe even in a different process, I could say, okay, I make it a call activity, and that means I isolate this, this process and say this is an extra process. So this gives me the opportunity to just maintain the process at one point. And so if I would need to make changes, I would have a separate process model that is called clean table, where I could make all changes. If I want to have it in the modeling perspective, what I could do is basically, if I just want to have the task once, let's see what we could do. If we have here the normal task, what I could try to do, let's see, the no pass is connecting here. What I could do is I could use a link event, and I could basically name this one here with a, oh no, that should be a throw here. So the link event is interrupting the sequence flows. It can be a help not to cross sequence flows, because if I want to merge them, I would likely cross them. So that's why I'm using a link event. And I can say here, table or clean needed. And then what I do here, I have another link event with a catch, and this says also clean needed. And now basically I would come here also to the clean table. What is not really nice now is, and maybe you figured it out, that now when I throw this link event and I catch it here, I also always come to the endpoint here of hunger satisfied, which is not super nice. But we talk about that in the second part of the video, because the second part was talking about scopes. And this process model is not perfect yet, because we still have a problem. Because if we talk about different scopes and also different people, we should ask ourselves the question, is a customer really part of our process? But that's something we will consider in the next part of this video series.